777 Brigade. Threat level is raised to bikini black, and reptilian craft have been spotted on the dark side.
We're live.
Hello, welcome to Windows on the World with me, Mark Windows, and of course Tony Hurst. Well, we're going to have a few guests on tonight, and we're going to start with a little summing up of what we've been talking about over the last few weeks. We've been talking about the controlling the narrative, especially in your own community. Now, we've covered this in many different respects. A few years ago, I wrote an article called Big Society Change Agents. The Big Society came out at the time of David Cameron, and what he was doing was introducing groups who were basically going to control the narrative. Now, these are community organisations, community interest groups, basically coming out of local councils and community hubs. And these community hubs seem to be quite important in this network, and everything to do with this is a network. Now, there's nothing sinister about this on the face of it. And for the last few weeks, we've been talking about social engineering. We've been talking about how the things that are happening and affecting us today were planned many, many years ago. And we featured a talk which was given off the cuff by Dr. Richard Day in 1969. Now, we don't need to go over that again. We've covered that in quite some depth. We did 2 whole shows on it, and they are available at windowsontheworld.net, and of course our YouTube channel, and we're on BitChute as well. We're also broadcasting on Spreaker, so we'd like you to subscribe to us on Spreaker if you haven't done already, and we're picking up a lot of hits on that. And I think the way things are going, and with all of this closing down of people's YouTube channels, censorship, which we're going to be talking about tonight, this is going to be quite important. So if people can listen to us on Spreaker, that will be great. We're also going out on a few different platforms as well. But getting back to this, we're talking about the narrative being controlled. And that little jingle at the beginning was actually from an idea that came out of this 77 Brigade, which was a group of British Army soldiers controlling the narrative on social media. And they're based in Reading, Berkshire, and they were named after an organisation within the army, in fact a regiment called the Chindits. And we did a whole show on that, and you can find that on Windows on the World, and you can also find it on our YouTube channel. And that was about 77 Brigade. It was called Facebook's UK Army Trolls. So what we're going to talk about is the way the narrative is being controlled up to a level that most people would not even imagine is happening in this country. A lot of people are aware of these organisations, these local organisations, these community interest companies, these organisations that recruit social entrepreneurs. We're all aware of people in our local council and in police, in fact, in all civil society, who are there controlling the narrative. Now, we're going to talk first about what's been happening with this prevent strategy. Now, the prevent strategy is a thing that's rolled out by local councils and the police, and it's deemed to be there for cracking down on extremism. And the thing is that about this extremism is it has to be defined. I'm getting something in my ear. I don't know who's there.
Chris has got his radio on. Hi, Chris. Turn your radio off, please, buddy. Or mute your mic.
Yeah, are you there, Tony?
Yep.
Hello. Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm getting interference. Someone's trying to call. And
it was Chris. It's sorted.
Oh, it's sorted. Great. Okay. I'm glad Chris is with us. So I'll carry on. Okay. So we've got this prevent strategy, and this is about countering extremism by the local council. And this week it's come into force in a way that many of our listeners will recognise. In fact, David Icke has had a talk cancelled because of this prevent strategy. Now, the prevent strategy is all about basically monitoring what's going on in local communities. And it states here, the government's national counter-terrorism strategy contest has 4 elements: pursue, protect, prepare and prevent. Prevent aims to stop people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. Education and skills providers, like other key sectors, have a responsibility to promote values of openness, tolerance, and facilitating free debate, which is central to being a British citizen. With the current government alert at Severe, and this was in 2015, this particular county council, their council skills and employability services, are required to be aware of risks and raise awareness within the local communities. And remember, this goes into schools, and it also goes into primary schools. It's called Keeping Children Safe in Education. The current threat from terrorism in the UK can involve the exploitation of vulnerable people, including children of all ages, young people and adults, to becoming involved in violent extremist activity in support of terrorism. Now, violent extremism is defined by the Crown Prosecution Service as the demonstration of unacceptable behaviour by using any means or medium to express views which encourage, justify or glorify terrorist violence in furtherance of particular beliefs, seek to provoke others to terrorist acts, encourage other serious criminal activity, or seek to provoke others to serious criminal acts, foster hatred which might lead to inter-community violence in the UK. Now, the aim of the Prevent strategy is to promote and reinforce shared values. Now, this is very interesting, isn't it? Because whose values are we sharing here? We're going to get onto that a bit later in the show. It says including British values, to create space for free and open debate and to listen and support the learner voice. To listen and support the learner voice. That's interesting. To break down segregation among different communities by supporting interfaith and intercultural dialogue and understanding, and to engage all learners in playing a full and active role in wider engagement in society. Provide a clear framework to structure and inform our response to safeguarding concerns, including a supportive referral process for those who may be susceptible to the messages of extremism. To provide support for residents who may be at risk of radicalisation and appropriate sources of advice and guidance, to ensure that staff are aware of their roles and responsibilities in preventing violent and non-violent extremism. Now, this is interesting because teachers in schools have a duty to look for what they think is extremism. Now, the way extremism is being defined most recently is by the threat of the far right. And we're going to get into that in the show, because that's very, very important. But now let's compare this with the kind of low-level surveillance and infiltration that's going on through these change agent groups, which are basically upholding things like social entrepreneurs. We did this article, Big Society Change Agents, which is the background of all this. You can find that at windowsontheworld.net. Now, says here, this is a PR company who are engaged in controlling the narrative of public opinion. It says, understanding the community and identifying the key players, or as we call them, useful idiots, not just from the internet, but from in-depth research. So, when things like regeneration are happening in your area, people are being embedded there to control the narrative. Now, if we take this up a step further, we're getting into this thing called the Prevent strategy, and also the think tanks that are controlling public debate. So it says here, get to know them, not just know of them, meet and listen to them. Identify supporters amongst the decision makers and those who influence them and begin to mobilise. Find out what they want, make it their project as well as yours. Now, this is a huge thing of controlling public opinion. What they do is they offer limited choices. You'll find this in council meetings. We've talked about this a lot. They use techniques such as Delphi technique, which is a way of controlling public opinion and narrative. And they make the public believe that they've agreed to what the intended outcome actually is. It carries on to broaden the consultancy, to engage the wider community in the process, to proactively engage in media. This is very important because you'll get local newspapers springing up, and they will contain all of the propaganda which is coming your way. We've talked about this over the last few weeks. All of these councils who are awarding things, they're getting awards. They're being awarded like the Borough of Culture, for instance, Waltham Forest, it's being awarded the Borough of Culture. And of course, that's there to do is control what's going on. In other words, the council are controlling the culture. It's not coming from grassroots. And this is the thing we hear all the time, grassroots organisations, which are mainly nothing of the sort. So it carries on, not just parliamentary engagement, parish councils and community organisations. Having run local elections for all the main political parties, this is a PR company, by the way, get this, having run local elections for all the main political parties, we have a unique approach to grassroots campaigning. So you might be thinking, how does this tie in with terrorism and extremism? Well, it's called controlling the narrative. And we've covered this on the previous shows that we've talked about. And what it's about is getting us into a consensus, a group think. So in other words, what we're being told at the moment is this growing threat from the far right. Now, this is coming out of think tanks and organisations such as Demos. And I want to read something which was put out by Demos in around 2014. They produced this document called The Power of Unreason in 2010, which was all about how to deal with talking about conspiracy theories, how to control the narrative of these people who believed that there was this huge conspiracy which controlled us. And what they do is they lay it out in very simplistic terms, and they use psychological subversion and go, oh, they do it, do they? Who's they? Well, I've just told you. A lot of these people are think tanks, they're government organisations. But, okay, let's go straight to the top. It's coming from the intelligence services. So this threat from the far right actually came from MI5. And then it filters down into these think tanks. And all of a sudden, we have a problem with the far right. Now, I challenge anybody looking out there to find real evidence that there's a threat from any far right groups in this country. We're going on to look at what these groups and organisations, and indeed this charity, Hope Not Hate, are saying about it, because they're merely repeating what the intelligence services are telling them. And we stated at the time when we were interacting with Demos that they'd openly said that they were in contact, and basically you could say they're under the thumb of MI5 and the intelligence services. So I'm just going to read something out which might be quite shocking to some people. This is Demos talking, okay, which is a government think tank. They stated, the new democracy will work with a combination of government, open infiltration, and citizen groups taking direct action. Now, what I said at the beginning of the show ties directly into this, because when we talk about citizen groups, we're talking about created citizen groups. We have to remember that these strategies by Demos and these other groups are funded by George Soros and Open Society. And that's another thing that people are trying to control the narrative, are trying to minimize. They're saying, oh, it's all Soros, is it? And of course, then it's it's anti-Semitic. We've already been through this with Soros, because Soros actually betrayed the Jews during World War II, and he openly says that. So George Soros is just a player. He's just playing, he's controlling the narrative, and he's got an idea of the way society wants to go. In my view, it's not the way I want society to go, because I like sovereign freedom. I like to be able to think for myself. And what we're finding is that those people who want to think for themselves are being marginalised and targeted. And I have had direct experience of this. We're going to have more of this in the coming weeks, because I think it's the most important thing that's not being talked about. So, Demos, here we go. A few years ago, in the European elections, they were talking about how they were going to control the narrative. And they said mobilising the vote through social media. This project aims to make social media tools available to civil society organizations. Civil society organizations. That's what we're talking about throughout Europe, so that they can mobilize people more effectively to vote in the 2014 European elections. Demos will produce tools and techniques like open source software that could be used to analyze real-time Twitter data in order to allow campaigners to increase turnout of target groups. These tools will be made available free of charge. Demos will also train advocates and civil society groups interested in civic and political participation through a series of 2-day face-to-face workshops in France, Greece, Hungary, Italy, and the Netherlands, and the UK. So we know that it's pan-European, at least, and beyond. Now, this is where it all gets interesting, because it ties into this global action plan of Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, which is all this regeneration we're seeing, all the hive housing. How does it tie into that? Well, it ties into it through these change agent organizations, because the change agent organizations like Locality, Intentionality, Unlimited, Power to Change, all these people we've talked about, bigsociety.org, all funded through the lottery, etc. Those are the people who are putting their people who've been mentored into this program into your local community, or what they call your local community. We have to remember that these organizations have very little support. If they put, well, there's very little public knowledge, so there's very little public support for them, but they are extremely powerful because they're funded, and it's all coming through these lobbying groups. So basically, these lobbying groups through Soros, the Open Society, etc., and the big lottery fund and the government, they're funding all this stuff. And is it the narrative that you want to hear? Because if you go onto YouTube and look at some of these organizations, such as Demos and Unlimited, which trains social entrepreneurs, or so-called social entrepreneurs, or change agents, then you will find that their videos have very few views at all, but they're hugely powerful. Now, this is the dichotomy. So these people are influencing, or having a great influence over what's happening in your life, and you have no interest in it at all because you haven't heard of them, which is fair enough. You haven't been told about them, but that's what we've been covering for the past 5 years. So I'm tying this all together, and we're going to go on to the prevent strategy very soon. But this is how it ties in with Demos. This is how this so-called strategy of countering what they're calling extremism ties into people who may be heretics. A heretic meaning somebody who can think for themselves. So heresy's always been very, very serious. I mean, I was out today, and we're making a documentary about the martyrs in Smithfield. They were all burned as heretics because they did not want the state to think for them. They didn't want a third party intervening between them and their own divinity, or them and their own thoughts. And that's what this is about. So we need, in my view, a new form of heresy. And these organizations are stating we're interested in how we can be used to inform decisions. Demos will also train advocates and civil society groups interested in civic and political participation. Now, this is going into all of these different funded minority groups, so-called minority groups, and it's going out into a spider's web. So if you look at the last 2 shows we've done on social engineering, they will help a lot because they put into perspective what this is about. Now, it's ironic that David Icke was talking about this speech by Dr. Richard Day in 1969, which predicted the new order, the new way things were going to be done, this surveillance society, this thing that Aldous Huxley talks about, the Brave New World, 1984. It was all laid out in 1969 in great detail as to how this was going to be achieved. So the whole background of this is there. There's no excuse for anybody not knowing about it, because this is something I come up time and time again, come up with people who say, what can I do about it? Well, what you can do about it is you can start by being aware of it, because if you're not aware of something and you're not reacting properly to it, then you are classed as basically a pauper, someone with no rights. You're classed as property of the state, quite rightly so, because if you do not exert and enforce your rights, you do not have any. And we're being told now that we don't have any rights. So this is where it all ties together. I'm going to bring in Tony now because we had a bit of noise there at the beginning, Tony. It was a bit distracting, but I think we're okay now. Had a few interruptions there with messages coming up on Skype, which were coming out very loud. Are you there, Tony?
Yeah, I'm here.
Great, good stuff. So, yeah, how are things in your world?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. I'm hanging in there, bearing up.
Good stuff. So, yes, I think the last few shows we've done on this subject are very, very important. And people can go back into the archive at Windows on the World and find some really good stuff there. Now, we're talking about controlling the narrative, nudging, steering, decision-making, manufacturing consent through things like the Delphi technique with what we call change agents, psychological subversion, Saul-Alinsky rules, the Saul-Alinsky rules for radicals, which were announced as a good idea by David Cameron in 2011, which encourage these groups to start controlling the narrative. And we're seeing an escalation of that. We're seeing it turn into what I could safely deem to be domestic extremism, terrorism. So in other words, we've now got to the point where this prevent strategy and all this stuff about countering terrorism is very important, because what we're finding is that ordinary people who stand up for their rights are being attacked by domestic extremists. Now, I'm not saying that these groups that we've talked about are engaged in that. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying there's another level to this, which is going higher and higher and higher, up to a point where we have got absolute criminal subversives who are attacking small businesses, small organizations, and basically the way society's being structured. So, yeah, we're going to go on now to the prevent again. We're going to go back to what I've been saying there. And yes, very interesting. This is about the rise of the so-called far right. The outgoing head of counter-terrorism policing in the UK has used his speech to warn against the rise of the far right, as he revealed 4 extremist right-wing plots were thwarted in 2017. Now, this is interesting. This is Mark Rowley, the Assistant Commissioner at the Metropolitan Police. Now, they said they've thwarted 4 extremist right-wing plots in 2017, but they haven't expanded any further on that. Now, this is exactly what comes out of MI5. Oh, we've stopped all these potential threats. They may well have done, but in most of these cases we're not getting any information, we're not getting any detail, so we don't know whether it's true or not.
Yeah, plots to do what? They could have been plotting to go down the pub. I don't know.
This is the point, because it's how things are being defined, and what's happening is that ordinary people are being attacked. For instance, David Icke had his talk cancelled because of this prevent strategy. And it came about because the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which is this tiny group which goes around threatening and bullying and harassing people. And it's really not about anti-Semitism as such. They find anti-Semitism. In other words, they find something to be offended about. This is all about the cult of hurt feelings. And this goes into what's happened with the Alison Shablow trial. And it goes into what's happened recently with David Icke. Now, David Icke quite rightly says that his talks do not promote anything which could be described as terrorism, because they don't. They're not a threat to anybody. They're a threat in some ways to the established order. There's no doubt about that. But he's not inciting people to rise up and do anything against the state. And that's very, very important. So what happened is the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism have called this venue, and then Prevent have got involved through the local council. Remember, the Prevent strategies through the local council, it came out of a thing called Contest. And it means that the local council have a duty to check out who may be vulnerable to extremism. So in other words, it's now gone into what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, open infiltration. So the state have taken it upon themselves to openly infiltrate what's going on at a local level. So this is taking the controlling of the narrative to another level, in my opinion. So we've got all sorts of things happening here. So this Mark Rowley, the Assistant Commissioner at the Metropolitan Police, drew parallels between far-right groups and figures and the Islamic extremists they claim to despise in the annual Colin Crampthorne Memorial Lecture in central London. Speaking 2 weeks before his 31-year career in policing comes to a close, Rowley revealed 4 extreme right-wing inspired plots were prevented last year. In a conference with journalists before the speech, Rowley said the far-right terror threat was significant and concerning, and the public should be gravely concerned by the existence of national action. Now, national action, we did a show on that about 18 months ago, and they've been banned in the UK. They're described as the white supremacist neo-Nazi group banned under terror legislation. So they've been banned. Yet, on Hope Not Hate's site, they're still there. And this is where it's all going to tie in, because Hope Not Hate have attacked speaking groups which involve people that I know, basically retired academics. And what they're doing is they're finding an enemy. You see, what I'm going to put out there is this. My personal belief, my personal opinion, is that there is no far-right threat. The far-right threat is being used to target people who may want to vote Brexit, who voted Brexit. And they may want to target people who go against the narrative that's being enforced upon them, which, in my view, is coming from the extreme left, extreme leftists. I'm not talking about Labour Party. I'm not talking about socialism. I'm not even talking about communism. I'm talking about a new extreme left ideology, which is intolerant. And the people who spout this ideology call people Nazis and fascists, but by their own definition of those terms, not mine and not the real definition of those terms, they are acting in exactly the same way. So in other words, it's reversal. And this is where the Saul Alinsky rules come in, the rules for radicals, which is worth looking up. And we may go over them a bit later in the show. But it carries on. The right-wing threat was not previously organised. It says here, the right-wing threat was not previously organised. So how's it all of a sudden become organised? Because I can't see any evidence of this being organised. Now, if you go on to YouTube and look up Hope Not Hate, you'll see some videos of them getting kicked out of local areas. And there's a fella there. Now, I don't know whether this fella's an extremist or not, but there's a load of people who surround this Nick Lowell's car, and they tell him he's not welcome there, to get back in and go. And there's another video of a group in Essex who are doing the same thing. Now, I'm not saying that that group are far right, because they're not far right. I've looked at their website, and what they are is basically, you could call them patriotic. You could, in some ways, say that they'd be against mass immigration. But there's no evidence on their website that there's anything extreme about what they're doing. Now, we've had my view is that that Britain First and Tommy Robinson are basically there as stooges. You know, they may not know it, but this is the front of this far right, which I don't think really exists. I'd like to bring you in, Tony, because I want to get your opinion on this. Are you aware of people with far right ideologies, not just within your circle, but locally where you are?
None at all. No.
No.
Plenty of them are anti-immigration, though.
Plenty what, sorry?
Plenty are anti-immigration. Heading
yes.
After that.
Now, this is the important thing, yeah? So being anti-immigration and wanting to control your borders is not xenophobia. It's not fear of foreigners. It's a totally different issue. These are two different things. So I think what we've got here is we've got people who actually care about their country, who are now in the minority, who are being labelled far right and extremist. And indeed, anybody who wants to stand up for any kind of individual freedoms over mass brainwashed consensus And that's what this is all about. That takes us back to that quote by Demos, which is absolutely sinister. The new democracy will work with a combination of government open infiltration and citizen groups taking direct action. Now, this has been going on in many people's lives recently, and mine. And it's got to the point where the controlling of the narrative is no longer the controlling of the narrative, it's actual terrorism, as defined by the Terrorism Act. Also, in my case, it comes under the Malicious Communications Act. And we're going to do a full report on this because we're collating evidence, and it's gone to the police. And the police are not doing their job here. So in other words, the police are spouting this stuff, that there's this far right, but they're doing nothing about these extreme left people who are basically being supported through Soros's groups, through local community action groups, etc. So there's one narrative being put into place. So I would say that what I think it is just to control the whole narrative of what's going on by the intelligence services. That's what it seems to be to me. And just carrying on with this, yes, this is a very interesting. I've just been doing a bit of research into this stuff today. Now, this was going back as far as 2005, so they're trying to push this far right agenda from then as well. And we've got to remember 2005. Yeah, that was the year of the 7/7 bombings, I think. So it says here, a 2005 study conducted by researchers from the University of Bonn, the Institute for the Study of Labour and the University of Zurich found that less affluent eastern areas of Germany recorded 3 times as many right-wing extremist crimes as per habitant as the more affluent western regions. Okay, so that's there. Now, what's coming out of Demos and what's coming out of the think tanks and what's coming out of the security services does not actually seem to add up with what's really happening. This is the point I'm trying to make. So let's go into some criticism of this prevent strategy. Now, this prevent strategy that's actually stopped David Icke from speaking in Leicester, I believe it is. The UK government's strategy to counter Islamist extremism is affecting the discussion of terrorism. The UN Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of assembly has said. It's ironic it comes from the UN. Attempts to identify and counter Islamic extremism through the PREVENT programme had created unease and uncertainty around what can be legitimately discussed in public. Now, this is where it ties into everything. Somebody got onto me a while ago and they said to me, the PREVENT strategy is not about Islamic extremism. It's about shutting us down. Now, let's have a think about this. Who's being targeted at the moment? Yes, the so-called far right and the so-called alt-right. Now, the alt-right is a media creation. And what we have to remember is that all of this is media created. Terrorism is a media creation because the act of terrorism is a small act which may have devastating consequences for small amounts of people. However, it's the media that brings it to the world's attention. It's the media that brings it into every home in the country. And this is where the intelligence services and all of these groups come in, controlling the narrative. It says, I heard reports of teachers being reported for innocuous comments in class. For example, the spectre of Big Brother is so large, in fact, that I was informed that some families are afraid of discussing the negative effects of terrorism in their own homes, fearing their children would talk about it at school and have their intentions misconstrued. They warned that PREVENT was having the opposite of its intended effect by dividing, stigmatizing and alienating segments of the population. PREVENT could end up promoting extremism rather than countering it, it said. Now, that's very interesting and a very strong point. Since last summer, it says here, PREVENT has obliged teachers to refer to police pupils they suspect of engaging in some sort of terrorist activity or radical behaviour. Now, this is not defined, you see. This is a problem. They're not defining what that is. So it could be anything. It could be somebody's opinion. So somebody's opinion is then deemed to be extremism. Well, that takes us to the root of the problem. These groups who are cultivating the cult of hurt feelings. The National Union of Teachers last month voted overwhelmingly to reject the programme over concerns that it causes suspicion in the classroom and confusion in the staff room. State surveillance in both its electronic and human forms had become an issue that risked undermining people's confidence in their rights of association. We raised concerns about the Investigatory Powers Bill, particularly its provisions for thematic warrants and online surveillance, saying it could have a grave impact on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. When you have a sense that there is spying going on at every corner, when you don't know who's a spy, it almost goes back to the communist days in the Soviet Union, he said. Who's a spy? Who's an informer? That's not a way anybody would want to live. Now, that is very ironic, because when I got into doing all this stuff and looking into what's going on and setting up websites, etc., there was always this idea that there was infiltration going on. Well, there was lots of infiltration going on, but now it's open infiltration. We're being told that it's open. So it's very interesting that people are actually against this, and they were against it about 10 years ago. So at this point, Tony, have you got anything you'd like to come in with? Just need to clear my throat.
I can't say as I have really, Mark. I'm just sitting here listening to this intently, and I mean the right wing business. I don't know that there's not an issue with it, although I don't actually know personally of one. But I think the numbers that have turned out on the streets for certain events and that show me that there probably is something going on there. But I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as what they're making it out. And I think it's like you say, it's all orchestrated and manufactured anyway. It does really remind me of a lot of what went on in the late 1970s, really. There's some parallels with that there.
No, exactly. I agree. And the reason I'm making this point, I'm not saying that there aren't people who are so-called far right. Of course there are. There's people who are far left, but there's all sorts of groups out there. But what they do, always, yes, and this goes to these old age pensioners who meet up and discuss what the state calls conspiracy theories. For instance, in the International Business Times, they've got a tattooed bald head with a swastika on the back of it. And it's meant to be representative of the people who go to these meetings that have been shut down. And there's nobody there like that. In fact, this is just a stock image that they put in. So what I would say, I'm not saying that those people with shaved heads, those people who are just thugs, don't exist. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that they're being used, that ideology is being used to attack people who aren't extremists at all, which we've clearly proved, because using the image of a swastika on the back of a bald head and someone with a big black flag or whatever to describe a debating society of pensioners is completely and utterly absurd, in my opinion.
Yep. And again, that's exactly the same thing as what they did in the late 1970s, from about 1977 onward, when the skinhead movement was overtaken by the right wing and fuelled by the media. There was a massive turnaround of events there that went on in front of people's noses, and I can see the same thing happening today. No one really worked it out, not really back then. It just didn't get worked out what was going on.
No. And that's an interesting point, because we weren't as aware of what was going on then, obviously, as we are now. And now it's been refined into an art, as we've been talking about, really, for the past 18 months. We've gone through how this comes down through things like the Tavistock Institute, excuse me, into these think tanks and into these change agent organisations. And I had a phone call tonight from somebody who was telling me that their organisation had been kind of taken over. People had come in. Basically, these people are very overconfident, very arrogant, and they start controlling everything. And this ideology that we're being pushed into, this Brave New World ideology, seems to be all about finding an enemy. And the people who are actually enforcing it, as we're saying, are using terrorist tactics now. So let's have a look at a bit more about Prevent, which came out of this contest strategy. This is the executive summary, and this was done by the Labour Party. They were concerned about it. It says, this briefing covers the areas in which Prevent is threatening human rights, as well as the counterproductive effects of the strategy's approach. Drawing on case studies, it will specifically examine the impacts on sectors that by statutory duty are bound to identify and report individuals at risk of being drawn into terrorism. Now, you see, again, it's so loosely defined that it means that the police or the local council could make anybody fit into that category. That's the problem with this Prevent strategy. It says, yeah, bound to identify, they're duty bound. Basically, they're duty bound to identify and report individuals at risk of being drawn into terrorism. The briefing will argue that this obligation has incited fear and suspicion, threatened human rights, and resulted in misguided referrals. There is no evidence to support the current strategy, while there's a growing number of incidents suggesting its effects are in fact counterproductive. Prevent is one of 4 programmes under the government's wider counter-terrorism strategy Contest, introduced in 2005. It has undergone numerous changes since then, with the most significant introduction of a statutory duty in the education and healthcare sector in 2015. Now that's interesting. Now they're bringing it into education and healthcare. The statutory duty obliges early to higher education institutions, prisons, local authorities, that's your local council, and NHS trusts, get this, NHS trusts to report individuals who show signs of being drawn into extremism. Now, we can see what's happening here. This is about people being targeted and sectioned. That's where this could go, and we've reported that that's where it has gone in the past in extreme cases. This duty consists of identifying those suspected of having extremist thoughts and referring them to Channel, a police-led intensive one-to-one mentoring programme that seeks to challenge violent extremism. So wait a minute, it's a police-led intensive one-to-one mentoring programme that seeks to challenge violent extremism. This is all about your local council and the police working together to identify who they believe is vulnerable to extremism. Now, I said this at the time, that it could be somebody who's got a problem with the council, like many of us. What's stopping some arrogant, overpaid, petty-minded bureaucrat from deciding that you're an extremist? Nothing, because it's their opinion, right? It's their opinion that you're an extremist. I mean, most of these people are easy to argue with, as we've been talking about over the past few weeks, and with this enforcement of what's going on locally by people who aren't even competent to do it. However, it carries on. Since its inception, strong criticisms and countless case studies have revealed the strategy's flaws. Perhaps the most controversial is the way in which Prevent threatens human rights. Specifically, it risks encroaching on freedom of expression, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, the right to privacy, and freedom from discrimination. The strategy's flawed assumptions, as well as the inadequate training it provides, has resulted in misguided referrals and has created an atmosphere of distrust and fear, both of which are counterproductive to its goal of preventing individuals from being drawn into terrorism. As multiple case studies and examples demonstrate, Prevent disproportionately impacts members of the Muslim community who feel both directly and indirectly discriminated against by its policies. Though the strategy applies to all, as we're finding out now, remember this was a few years ago this was written, Muslims make up a significantly higher number of those referred to Prevent and Channel, resulting in them feeling unjustly targeted. Well, that's bound to happen, obviously, because the terror threat is coming from allegedly, and in the first place, Islamic extremism. But now it's been turned around, and this is what ties into what I've been told over the past couple of years, that people were telling me it's not for that, it's for going against people who may have a contrary belief to the mass consensus. In other words, thought police. This presumption is not backed by evidence, and coupled with a lack of training for those expected to monitor and report risks causing misguided referrals. Although the divisive effects of a focus on Islamic extremism are significant, the impacts on freedom of speech are also felt widely. Prevent poses a serious threat to freedom of expression. This is largely due to the problematic definition of extremism. Exactly. So it's all down to them how they define extremism, which puts individuals at risk of being referred to for lawful speech. So in other words, if you're acting within the law, you can still be targeted because it's about someone's opinion. Although the right to expression is not absolute and must therefore be balanced with the best interests of society, well, that's a bit controlling as well. What are the best interests of society? What are the best interests of society? That is also open to interpretation, because what I'm seeing is things that are being brought in which are not in the best interests of what I would call society. And this we're going to get to in part 2 about what people are defining as their community. That's an interesting one. Although the divisive effects of a focus on Islamic extremism are significant, the impacts on freedom of speech are also felt widely. Prevent poses a serious threat to freedom of expression. This is largely due to the problematic definition of extremism, which puts individuals at risk of being referred to for lawful speech. Yes, okay. Now it says most prevalent in education, Prevent has inserted itself into an environment where students should feel safe to develop and debate ideas. In many cases, students are being targeted for things they have not actually said, but which have been distorted or inferred by third parties. This is going to be extremely important in the second part of the show, because this is where it's all going. I'm going to read you out something that is so shocking. It is actually extremism, and it's not being defined within this Prevent strategy. And that is very interesting. So this extreme leftist hate-filled ideology that is being propagated against people is not even part of this strategy, because it's part of the accepted norm. It's part of the accepted norm for people to be influenced by these change agent groups and open society groups, and to think that groups like Antifa are acting within the law when in fact they're not. Antifa is just one strand of this, and of course that is the sort of terrorist end of it. However, what's tied to that are groups and organisations, and indeed charities like Hope Not Hate. Hope Not Hate is a charity, and it's meant to counter the politics of extremism and hate. What it actually does is it targets people, finds targets, and agitates people who are actually within the law. Now, because they're being instructed by the intelligence services, they are propagating this view that everything is about the far right. And the reason this is important is because of what we're talking about. Brexit's far right. Of course, we remember what happened with the Joe Cox murder. We even covered it on Windows on World. We actually did an investigation into what happened on that. Now, Brendan Cox has been pretty disgraced because of his abuse of women, but you won't find that on the Hope Not Hate website. He's a big part of Hope Not Hate. In fact, he was their front person for quite some time, because Joe Cox Memorial Foundation funded Hope Not Hate and the White Helmets in Syria. And this is the huge hypocrisy of the extreme left. They absolutely propagandize, use hate speech against those that they want to silence. Yet, when one of their own ranks are exposed, they seem to disappear very quickly. Could that be because the state is involved in controlling the narrative? I think there's a very good possibility. Here we go. So let's just see, this was a few years ago, a result of the Prevent strategy. A 14-year-old Muslim schoolboy was left scarred and nervous after he was questioned by school officials in North London for using the word eco-terrorism in a French class. He was interrogated even after explaining that he was referring to extreme environmental protests he had learned about in the debate club. His parents say he was visibly distressed and confused by the incident. This is a great example of what I've just said. So, he's talking about eco-terrorism, extreme green ideologists. Well, according to the new paradigm, that's not extremism. What could be classed as extremism is people who say things about Greenpeace, maybe. Maybe it's people who actually don't believe in climate change as anthropological climate change. The CO2 scam, in my opinion, and also we've done a lot of research onto that. In fact, it was at Piers Corbyn's birthday party last night, and he gave a great speech on it, as usual. And of course, now we're being told we're going into another ice age. However, a mini ice age. But this is incredible, isn't it? So he was questioned by school officials. Now, who are school officials? Teachers, headmaster in North London, for using the word eco-terrorism in a French class. So he's mentioned the word eco and terrorism in the same sentence, and he's now being defined as somebody who may be vulnerable to extremism. Although it is easy to defend erring on the side of caution, the danger of misguided referrals should not be underestimated. Fear of being misunderstood and classified as extremist leads many to avoid discussing sensitive topics. Freedom of speech is itself a British value. Now remember that we had British values redefined a few years ago. And of course, we had groups like Hope Not Hate doing this British Garden Party where they're recruiting people, not very successfully. However, they're hugely funded, and of course, they're a charity. And they beg for donations. They were begging for donations to sue Nigel Farage. You may remember that. And it said that the government promotes British values, and yet the chilling effect may result in self-censorship, which risks deterring people from exercising this right, which is exactly what's going on, controlling the narrative. In an interview with Rights Watch UK, an East London teacher recalls that as the awareness of Prevent increased, and specifically when it became a duty in school, political discussion and debate ceased suddenly with all the Muslim students that I teach, and I believe that this was a direct impact of the fear that they might be reported to the security services, as is now the duty of teachers. Now get that. The teachers not only have a duty to report you to the police and to the council, but also the security services. So that's the counter-terror police. Now, this is also interesting because all we get out of the counter-terror police is the rise of the far right. Now, in my opinion, and I think I'm right here, these officers who are propounding this stuff from their offices know nothing about it. They don't do any research into it. They are given this stuff from the security services and they parrot it on the news. So in other words, it's the media creating the whole thing. That's my view on it. And in part 2, yes, we're going to go into the more extreme side of it. But basically, this carries on. The vague and unsupported indicators of vulnerability to being drawn into terrorism cast the net of potential referrals extremely wide. Overly broad qualities such as a desire for political or moral change, are among those listed in Channel's Vulnerability Assessment Framework. These indicators, coupled with a heightened apprehension towards Islam following the spate of attacks connected to the Islamic militant group ISIL, means individuals who demonstrate increased religiosity of strong political views are at risk of being targeted by Prevent. A 17-year-old college student in Birmingham was alerted to Prevent officers after his teacher noticed him becoming more religious and wearing an Arab gown. The boy responded that he wanted to emulate the Prophet, and it was his choice to wear the gown. He had no prior history of trouble and was confused that no one from the faculty had spoken to him before putting forth the allegations. This is the point, isn't it, really? That you've got this snitch culture going on where people snitch behind your back. They won't even come up to you and say, "Are you all right? Is there anything going on?" I mean, I'm a teacher, we have to ask these sort of things. That would be the sensible way to do it. The teacher would go, "Well, we have to ask these things. I hope you don't find it offensive, but can we just chat about it and clear it up now?" That's what should happen, but it's not, is it? The teacher is snitching to the police and to the intelligence services. So, yeah, I think we should wrap that up for now, Tony. Have a little break because I've just been having a bit of trouble with my voice there as well. I need to clear my throat.
Yes, I'm concerned for you from the chat room about that. So hopefully you'll be better after this. What have we got? We've got, how do you pronounce this? Anne Pigalle?
Yes, this is Anne Pigalle, the last chanteuse, a friend of mine. We've had her on the show, actually. And it's a little number from her. So we'll have a bit of a break now. I'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Entrée dans la danse. Yeah?
You've got it, champ.
First bit of French I've done since school. Well done, Mark.
Merci.
Bagatelle et Victor Hugo et le Moulin Rouge. Et Proust et Étiard et les puces de Saint-Ouen et Angelina et chez Carmen et les Loubards et les branchés et les débranchés et les travelots du bois de Boulogne et chez Natacha la cloche et les lilas, la salsa aux étoiles, les sorts de galerie, les frites à Barbès, le Sancerre au Sancerre, le Snake Club, le Club Bouvard, le Fan Club de Claude, les pétasses au bain-douche et les branchés de Radio Nova, le marché de la moquette à Saint-Antoine. Et entrez donc dans la danse. 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 Et puis Molière et ses aracans, la porte dorée, promenade des Anglais, des galissons d'ex-festival d'Avignon. À Saint-Trope, c'est trop chez Cartier, c'est Charrier, c'est Chartier, c'est bon. Et Pauline Carton, Carl Perron, les travelots au bois de Boulogne. André Breton, Renaud Citroën, Citroën et Renaud Citroën. Et le Camembert et la vache Kelly et Versailles et la Cour Carrée et Victor Hugo et Charles Baudelaire et Edith Piaf et Françoise Hardy et Christian Dior et Alexandre et André Breton et Charlemagne et Amélie Poulain et le chocolat Lanvin et les bêtises de Cambrai et le foie gras et D'Artagnan et Milady et Charles de Gaulle et Nostradamus vont au plus.
My DVD plays my MP3s. I downloaded the manual online for free. And I got BVTI, I got my TV from Sky, I got my telephone number, it's as big as the sky. So bring it over here, plug it in the wall, make the lights go on and on. We'll take it out the fridge, put it in the microwave, let's do something cool and stuff around the space-safe digital world. We'll be good boys and girls, and we'll all sing along as the numbers they go, they go. Oh oh one oh one oh 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 one oh one oh one one oh one 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 oh oh one one. It's a digital world. We'll be good boys and girls. We'll all sing along with the numbers as they swirl around, round, 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 round. I got megapixels and Formula One, got GPS and a camera phone. No, I don't speak out, no, I don't make a fuss, because you bought me off with all the latest stuff. Am I lucky number 7 and 6 and 17? I always play those numbers on the lottery. So bring it over here, plug it in the wall, make those lights go on and on. You can
Welcome back to Windows on the World. Yes, I'm slightly more refreshed now. I should have cleared my throat. In fact, I should have done my opera singing exercises before I came on air. I'll have to remember to do that next time. However, we've been talking about controlling the narrative. Before we bring Chris on, we've had Chris on before talking about how the narrative's being controlled in his area. I'm going to read out that quote from Demos, which is this government think tank, which seems to take it upon itself to impose this new paradigm, this new way of looking at things, which is controlling the narrative, which is basically disempowering us so that we can't think for ourselves. I'm going to just make this quote again because it's very, very important as to what we're talking about tonight. The new democracy will work with a combination of government open infiltration and citizen groups taking direct action. We're going to take things a step up in this part of the show because over the past 18 months, I've been involved with an organisation, some friends of mine who I helped out, and they have been mercilessly attacked. The organisation has been under every kind of attack that you can possibly imagine, from libel to violent disruption, infiltration, and basically people defining themselves as a community. And this runs along with these terrorist organizations, these ultra extreme left, and I'm not talking about socialism here. We know the left-right paradigm, or the left and right, doesn't really exist. A lot of this is a media creation. The alt-right, for instance, it's merely people who want to go against the extreme left. So I found something on a Facebook post, and it was put there by somebody who is a change agent trying to control the narrative in what they call their community. Remember, it's not our community, it's their community. So they're not talking about community as a whole. They're talking about what they define as their community. Now, I hope this is going to sink in with people, because this is going on all over the country, all over the world, really, where these change agent groups are involved, or where these extreme left groups are involved. This is what the post says. And it's about how to deal with people who they do not like, who they deem to be outside what they call their community. So, someone in your community has been named as abusive. The most useful thing you can do right now is to hold them accountable. But how? This is not about punishment, divining the absolute truth of a situation, so give that up right now. Alongside language like innocent, guilty, allegations, and the accused, survivors get nothing for telling the truth. This stuff is, in capital letters, group work. Remember, what we're being put into here is group consensus over sovereignty, being able to think for yourself. This is a Borg. It's basically a machine-like reaction. This stuff is group work. You and some trusted others need to get together and commit to this. Taking action on this is not talking or gossip. It's having a backbone. Set up a secure way to discuss, taking some of the following practical steps immediately, and let others know that you are doing so. Let the survivor lead on what they want to happen, but don't make them do the work. Now, what they're calling a survivor here is not somebody who survived some terrible ordeal. They're talking about somebody who may have interpreted that they have had their feelings hurt. That's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about somebody who's actually been physically beaten up or anything that could be actually construed as a crime. We're talking about a thought crime here against their community. So it carries on. Contact the person who's been named as abusive and demand that they publicly acknowledge and engage with the disclosure in a non-defensive way even if they fully deny any wrongdoing whatsoever. Can you see what's going on here? So they're telling you that you can't deny it. So one of their community has felt offended. And you're going to turn around and go, well, it's their problem if they feel offended. That's my point of view. That, according to them, is not acceptable. Okay? So we're talking about absolutely unreasonable, tyrannical, what they would call fascist Nazi ideology. That's their terms, by the way. Now, take a step back from social media and other public platforms to reflect on themselves. Take a break from being involved in music. All of this was to do with the music scene, but it goes into everything, okay? To consider how they have harmed people. Appreciate why people may not feel safe in their presence at gigs and comply with requests. Educate themselves fully on consent, emotional manipulation and personal boundaries. Engage in therapy or counselling or another form of intervention that addresses abusive behaviour. Engage with any other appropriate support services, e.g. rehab. Okay, so they're covering a lot of stuff here. Inform future partners. Now get this. Inform future partners of their abusive history and the steps that they have taken to be better. Anything else that the survivor may explicitly want. So, in other words, somebody's been hurt by somebody or feels that they've been hurt. And this person, no matter how long ago it was, is going to have that thrown back at them time and time again. This is total Saul Alinsky programming. Not letting up on somebody who's been targeted. This is actually what they could call gang stalking. So you've got this community involved in gang stalking. Basically getting a group of people to attack one person with ad hominem or basically reject them. It's like what they used to do to heretics, publicly burn them or humiliate them. And heretic just means somebody who is able to choose. In other words, if you can think for yourself, you're outside the paradigm. It says, meanwhile, you should be making it publicly clear that the person's bands or projects will not be given a platform until the above things have happened. So under an assumption, they're going to try and ruin your whole career. And what I have to say at this point is the person who had this on their Facebook page made a malicious and untrue allegation about a venue that I know very well. And the reason they made that allegation is because that venue doesn't fulfill what their community wants. Remember, they haven't got a community. Everyone in that venue was happy and safe. There's no problem there. They wanted to introduce their narrative all over it. In other words, it's not safe until we say it's safe. So what we're going to do in the meantime is we're going to pick on somebody we don't like, and we're going to absolutely libel and destroy your venue and your people until you publicly apologize and admit to what we say you have done. Right, so it says challenging vigilante behaviour or the performative displays of machismo, even if well-intentioned, avoiding unexplained cancellations or the cowardly avoidance tactics that seek to hide abuse, avoiding unexplained cancellations. So in other words, you can't just pull out of it if you think you're being targeted by these people. You have to openly say that you've done something wrong. It's quite unbelievable. And this idiot who had this on her Facebook page writes for The Guardian, by the way. A culture of don't talk SHIT contributes to the silence that gives a straight up green light to abusive people, regularly updating through whatever channels feel appropriate about the progress of all this. Now, this is not a quick fix. The steps above can take time. Early intervention is best. Sorry, let me just recap on this. Okay, yes. Yes, let's carry on. Engage in therapy or counselling, yes. Intervention. Right, yes. Challenging vigilante behaviour or other performative displays of machismo, even if well-intentioned. Yes, we've had that. This is not a quick fix. The steps above can take time. Early intervention is best. None of these things involve the state or the police. Isn't that interesting? So in other words, they are acting as the law. And this is a problem that we've been up against. The small organisation. We've been up against people who are using terrorist tactics and libelling us, screaming at us in public as though we are criminals. And there's nothing we've been able to do about it. However, the police are now involved. But what they're saying is that we don't involve the police or the state. This is us. This is our community. You may notice the idea that the UK criminal justice system is the best arbiter of reality is the biggest joke going. And no one is laughing here. Remember that survivors are everywhere, listening and watching and making notes of who sits on their hands when a disclosure is made. If you follow the above steps, you'll be actively helping the survivor, reducing the otherwise high chances of this person causing further harm in future and helping to create a safer, more inclusive and generative community. We can all do better. So that is domestic extremism, in my opinion. And we're going to bring Chris in now. Chris, have you ever heard anything like that before?
Well, I've heard similar, not exactly the same. And going back to, when I was on before, we was talking about that planning application where they want to build a massive estate around where I live. It would appear that the local people, something has happened which has completely puzzled me. Now, I'll give your listeners the information, the very sparse information I have, and they might be able to put the pieces together. But to recap very quickly, about 4 or 5 years ago, there was an application put in for about 60 houses, and now all hell broke loose. There was police called out because there was a protest outside the local council offices. There was petitions put in of hundreds of signatures, and absolutely unbelievable. This time, there's 340 houses putting in, and where I live, there's been other people against it, but round my vicinity, there's only 4 people objected, including me. Now, the person before, about 4 or 5 years ago, who was helping, who was kind of running things, he's done the square root of nothing. And I spoke to him a little time ago, and I said, what's going on? And he said, and this was it. I can't remember it verbatim, but it was, we were told that we've won. This was 4 years ago. He said this. He said this about 4 years ago. He said, we were told at the time that we've won this time, but in the long term, you won't win. And the next application is pointless, objecting to it. Now, he was one of the people that was organising the protests 4 years ago. Now, I don't know who said this down the local council. Could be a councillor, could be one of these change agents. I don't know. And he was called away just as I was about to say, who said this? And he's avoiding me and everyone else like the plague. And I want to find out who actually said this to him, because that news has spread like wildfire. And I just can't believe it that there's only 4 people that's objecting to this huge state, where before there was hundreds.
This goes back to what we were talking about in the first half, and people may not see the connection, but I'm trying to bring it together here, in that it's about controlling the narrative. Now, in that first half, we were going about an organisation that you introduced me to, who were actually the PR company, who were stating that they were going to identify the key players, get them on board, and find out what they wanted and make it their project as well as ours. Broaden the consultancy to engage the wider community, proactively engage in media, and yes, identify the key players or the useful idiots, not just from the internet, but in-depth analysis. And this is what seems to be happening. I've just given you an extreme example of that, of people who are just saying that we're lawless and this is our community. I've had threats on my phone saying that if I didn't resign my position at this particular organisation, then they would rise up an army and expose me in their community. They haven't got a community. We're talking about 2 extremists and a bunch of people who follow them because they're stupid. But this is what I've been talking about the whole show. In other words, it doesn't matter what level this happens at. the results are pretty much the same. I've been talking about an extreme example of it, where people's lives are being put in danger by people who think that because you're outside of their opinion, then they can terrorize you. The Terrorism Act 2000 is defined as it involves serious violence against a person, involves serious damage to property, endangers the person's life other than that of the person committing the action, creates a serious risk to the health or safety of the public or a section of the public, or is designed seriously to interfere with or seriously to disrupt an electronic system, and the use or threat is designed to influence the government or to intimidate the public or a section of the public, and the use of threat is made for the purpose of advancing a political, which is what this is I was talking about, religious or ideological cause. So that covers everything, okay? So we're talking about a lower level thing here with Chris, but what you just said, Chris, was that you don't understand how all these people were against it, and now there's only 4 people against it. Well, I think it's this PR company, because weren't they doing surveys and getting involved in the local communities and recruiting the people they needed?
Yes, and if you look on you can actually see what has been submitted to the local council. What they're doing, they're going around estates that are reasonably new, and I don't know what they're saying to the people, but there's block approvals of this new estate. And, you know, it says, Mrs. Whoever, I approve of the new estate. And then you see the next one, I approve of the new estate. I think it's marvellous. So they've obviously, I would assume, they've gone round the doors, a bit like Jehovah's Witnesses, I suppose, and just said, what do you think of this? Or they've again, I don't want to put 2 and 2 together and make 100, but I really do believe that they've obviously said something or presented this awful estate that they're going to build in a way that is, you know, through rose-coloured spectacles. I just don't know what they've said to these people, but you know, there's been more blocks of people saying that they think it's marvellous and they approve of it, and their addresses. And the people haven't done it themselves. It's this company that's done it. That's pretty obvious, that is. And it seems to be, what I have noticed, if you look at the people that are agreeing with it, it seems to go down 2 modes of thought. One is snobbery. One says, I hope they are executive home. Words like, I hope they're executive homes and none of the old council house people up here. And the other type is that, well, we desperately need these homes because my family can't, you know, my daughter can't afford to buy a flat even. So looking between the lines, it would appear that they've obviously tapped into those 2 emotions, but how they've done it, I don't know. But
absolutely. Well, it goes into PR, it goes into community organisers. People who are community organisers listen individually to residents, identify and inspire local leaders, and bring people together to take action on the issues they all care about. In areas where community organisers work, people have a stronger sense of belonging to their neighbourhood. They feel more valued and are motivated to work together to improve lives and transform where they live. Does that sound like the sort of people who may be controlling the narrative?
Yes.
I think we've spoken about that before. I knew that I was going to get that answer, but it's kind of incredible, isn't it? I'd like to bring Kevin in now. Kevin Boyle, if that's possible. Is he there, Tony?
I just asked him to turn his radio off, and I'll give him a call in right now. Add him to the group.
Okay. Well, this is Kevin Boyle, and we met many years ago, and Kevin's part of the Keep Talking group, which have been actually targeted over the years, quite ridiculously, in my opinion.
Sorry, that was jumped on me very suddenly there.
Hang on, Kevin, I'm talking. Okay, I'm just going to bring you in. Okay, yeah. And this group were being targeted quite, I mean, it's just so over the top that you've got this Hope Not Hate and even Antifa getting involved in picketing their events. And Hope Not Hate must have nothing to put on their website apart from the rather tiresome, as we've stated, growing threat of the far right, because they keep targeting a particular person in the group as though he's some kind of extremist. And we're talking about basically someone who's retired and writes on what the state would call conspiracy theories. And this is the desperate nature of it all. And the reason I wanted to tie it all together was because of this more extremist element. So, Kevin, you've seen the latest nonsense post from Hope Not Hate. What do you think about it?
Well, it's just their usual stuff. I mean, they've in the context of the meetings that I sometimes attend with the, you call them these pensioners. And they are mostly pensioners. Nearly all of them are over 50. We were going to have a meeting in Conway Hall to discuss the inaugural lecture of Professor Bailey about World Trade Center 7. He's the head of St Mary's University, London University, and that was what the meeting was about. But Hope Not Hate besieged Conway Hall and mentioned that there's a guy who sometimes speaks to our group, or as a member of our group, called Nick Colostrom, who's like Britain's most. Well,
it's very funny to us, Kevin. I'll just explain who Nick is. Nick kind of lost his job for questioning certain aspects of what is known as the Holocaust, which is used as a political tool and used to shut people down if they question it or talk about it. And of course, we had Theresa May complicit in redefining what it was to talk about it, all the rest of it. But we're talking about things that should be open for debate here. And we're talking about a venue which has prided itself on open debate for about 100 years, which is Conway Hall. It was set up to challenge the so-called state, the status quo. It was set up. Yes.
The home of free speech in the UK,
Yes. So the thing is that Hope Not Hate have targeted this group 3 times now. And it is just a debating society. And yes, there was going to be a talk there about this fellow, Bailey, who'd just done a presentation which was trying, in my opinion, what I saw of it, to debunk the idea that Building 7 of the World Trade Center was brought down by a controlled demolition. So he was trying to say that, yes, office fires brought the building down. And there was some opposition, quite rightly so, to that in our group, or the group that you and I have frequented over the years. And that's what it was about. Unfortunately, the lady who was at the Bailey lecture about World Trade Center 7 couldn't make it. I think it was something to do with the weather. And Nick decided to jump in at the last minute. And they found out, and all of a sudden, we've got this extremist, a terrorist, is somebody who's a terrible anti-Semite and a Nazi and all these other things. And he wasn't going to talk about anything to do with that, was he, Kevin?
Sorry. He was. I'm not quite sure. I mean, he was going to stand in if the lady didn't make it. I think that's what it was.
Yes.
But it's nothing to do. Nothing. It wasn't going to. I mean, there's never been ever any discussion of the Holocaust in that group. There's been lots of others, but we've been shut down 3 times. So what that means is that the home of free speech in Britain will not allow free speech for our group because another person they don't like is in the building. There were 6 talks booked, right? He might have spoken at one of them. They've all been cancelled because he might have been in the building at the time. And that's absolutely outrageous. I mean, it's like you couldn't really make that stuff up. But you could. Well, it's becoming familiar. But I mean, it's all about these people protecting their lives, Mark. That's all. They're just. It's just. There's nothing unfamiliar about any of this to us, is there? I mean, it's just the same old stuff. We're used to it. We are. Hello?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm just looking on their website now. It says, last week, the importance of tackling online hate was once again thrown into stark relief when the murder trial of Darren Osborne heard how his deadly hatred of Muslims was the result of online radicalization. Now it says, now this is the interesting bit, yeah? Hope Not Hate, this kind of charity, which has side of it that's a limited company. Now this is just some organization of a couple of people, really. Hope Not Hate is calling on the UK government to take action against far-right websites. Now, it's not about taking action about far-right websites. It's about taking action against websites they particularly don't like, including several of the most extreme neo-Nazi and Holocaust denial websites. Now, that's down to them to define.
Well, hey, Mark, it's just another element in controlling the narrative. I mean, if you look at the BBC this past week, they've had a guy on wall-to-wall coverage of a guy called Bill Browder, who is one of the world's great criminals, right? And they interview this guy, consistently interview him with an attitude as if he's the bloody Dalai Lama. You know, they kind of genuflect before this guy who actually projects all his own crimes onto Putin. He says Putin's the biggest criminal murderer in the world. In fact, when this guy was around in the 90s, he played a big part in transferring money to these Russian oligarchs who robbed the entire country. He should have been locked up or worse decades ago. Well, a long time ago. And this is the kind of person whose narrative is projected intensively into the British society, while at the same time harmless old people like Nick Colostrom, you know, who'd fit very well into a kind of 1940s genteel English comedy, you know, is depicted as the world's greatest, or the UK's greatest Nazi. It's absolutely astonishing stuff when you actually know what's going on. But I mean, it doesn't do the ordinary person much harm. That they know, because they don't really come into contact with it. But if you try and say anything that really, the thing is, Mark, that people should be aware that actually, even in spite of all this stuff, these people are still not winning. At the minute, there's all this, while Syria is being cleaned up by the Russians and Assad and all that, and the war is kind of ending to a large extent there. And basically, the UK and America, or the people who run our country, are very angry about it. They're pushing out all this anti-Putin rhetoric. It's incredibly dangerous because we don't know where it's going. But people aren't buying it, though. I mean, you only have to look at the comments in papers. You have to listen to phone-in radios. Loads of people are just, you know, that's why they couldn't bomb Syria about 3 or 4 years ago, because the public wouldn't have it. So, you know, people are getting it, you know, obliquely and kind of into the subconscious. The kind of awareness is there. But the actual people in charge are absolute fiends, and they're going to continue doing this. All you can do is inform people more. But you know that this stuff is people are becoming more aware of it. And we just got to pray really that the kind of the people at the top start becoming more and more afraid of what ordinary people really think of them. You know, and that's what we're working towards. You know.
No, I agree with that, because what's the main point about these sort of groups like Hope Not Hate and this sort of extreme far left is it's not the majority at all. But what they're doing is they're imposing themselves, and that was the whole point of the show, in that it gets to a more extreme end. I mean, yeah, Hope Not Hate, they're a bit of a joke, in my opinion, because they haven't really got an enemy. They haven't got a real enemy. And as
you say, Mark, yeah, there's probably only a small office of them with about 2 permanent employees or something. You know, they're nothing other than the fact that they do what they do, and they've got they can use anti-Semitism and all this kind of stuff to blacken anyone's name. You know, and they're just like the radio people do, just like the BBC do, just like all the mainstream media do. They just use the same old tricks all the time to cover their lies, their warmongering lies. That's what they do, okay? We know, and lots of people are understanding that about our society now. And we've just got to hope that moderates or limits the action of the kind of psychopaths who actually lead this bloody country, you know? That's it.
Exactly. And the thing is that I wanted to bring all this together because of what's been happening around me and around people that I know are very decent recently. I mean, I had someone on the phone tonight who was telling me about a similar situation that's happened with this little charity in North London, which you're familiar with, Kevin. I know you are. But
what's that, Mark? Which one?
The charity in North London. I think you've been up to that building, and we are going to be doing a.
Oh, yeah. I know. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. We're going to be doing a show on that, but it's still in the hands of people who are looking into it properly. Because what we want to do is find out who's behind these terrorists, because I'm not using that word lightly, but what I wanted to do with this show is to bring it into that bigger picture. Is what we're always trying to do. So yeah, we're talking about these silly little groups really, and then it goes into this prevent strategy, which is getting quite sinister, shutting down people like David Icke, Hope Not Hate, phoning up and shutting down your. Yes, carry on.
That I mentioned to you this week is kind of a parallel piece of information, but
yes,
I was I was going to a music session down in South Wimbledon, it was in Merton, this week, and basically, to cut long story short, I couldn't park. And there was all these new buildings come up. They're not yet occupied. And I said when I got into the session, some of the locals, I said, shortly no one will be able to park a car around it because they're building all these flats. You already can't get a space. And one of them told me that for the people who buy those flats, a condition of the mortgage is that they promise that they will not buy a vehicle. Now that's really Soviet. These are kind of things that are, they're not. You've probably got a better way of expressing this than I have, Mark. But it's like that's a real. This kind of control is like it's seeping. It is all-encompassing. It's kind of mild in one way and completely overpowering in another. I mean, it's society has been engineered by these bloody fiends who run everything, and it's been done in the most subtle ways that really are hard to oppose, other than to do the kind of thing with you. I suppose you and other people are doing is inform. It's kind of in top.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what we've been doing for quite a long time, and we do go over this stuff quite a lot. But what I'm seeing is like the bigger picture, expanding it into how it goes into much higher levels of extremism now. So basically, what we've got is this ideology, which is now extremism, and there's different levels of it. So you've got your change agents, you've got these people who are the sort of people you see in your local council, then you've got these things like the prevent strategy, and then above that you've got this other group which are absolutely tyrannical and lawless, and they're openly saying that we're going to oppose the law, we're going to take the law into our own hands, and there's nothing you can do about it. That was the point I was trying to make, Kevin.
Yeah. Well, it comes to, you see, the thing. This is where they kind of make the mistakes, Mark, I think, because the kind of thing that people do start to understand before they understand all this, this kind of deep politics that you go into, they understand that the police don't represent them anymore. They understand that if you have a problem, you can't. First of all, they don't respond to you, and secondly, if you want to go to them, you can't even get in the building. If you can find a building locally, so these things are. I mean, I've got a long story about how the police have really upset people near me. I won't go into it, but I mean, people are just astonished by how they're treated by authority now. And this stuff, it's kind of Soviet, but it's kind of productive because people talk about it, and we know that there's something going badly wrong here, badly wrong, and people are getting that idea quite a lot, I think.
Absolutely. So, Chris, are you still there? I can't hear him.
Yes, I'm still here. Yeah.
Oh, we're not boring you, Chris. I was just going to see, how does that resonate with you in Hertford at the moment, apart from what you've already told us?
Well, it seems to be what I call the hidden hand. Stuff's going on, and people don't kind of realise it. They're being manipulated, but you tell them that they're being manipulated, but they don't believe you.
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? It's I suppose that you think that there's a big them who can them control it. Well, who's them? I mean, I don't see that. I'm sure if they existed, we'd know about them. You get these idiotic answers when on people are talking on that level that they've been totally brainwashed by the television, because anybody can actually see this stuff just with a bit of research, But I think what's interesting is that when you really come up against it and put yourself out there, it's like putting stuff out like wins on the world. It's amazing what actually comes back, and the extremism of these people, because what we're doing really is promoting tolerance. And you've got these people who are absolutely intolerant, and they call you a Nazi. I mean, can you get this right? I've been called a white supremacist. I mean, it's the most absurd and ridiculous, but they use very limited text. So, in other words, if you're not in Antifa, then you're a white supremacist. Now, the idiot who put this online is a white, middle-class, privileged person who went to Cambridge University, okay? So, this is absolutely absurd. So, you've got someone who's going on about white privilege or white supremacism or whatever they talk about, and they are the ones with the privilege. And what they do is they virtue signal behind what they think are minority groups. So it's the worst kind of racism going. I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. But as for the police, I mean, I've been trying to complain about this Kent police for 2 years. Now, I went to the inspector of the chief constable, and I've been writing to the chief constable, who's failed to respond to anything I've said. And these are serious allegations. These should be of public concern because it involves the abuse of the Crime Stoppers website, us having that taken down. You can see all that stuff on Windows on the World, crime farming in Kent. Take a look if you haven't gone into that, because it's pretty shocking stuff. Well, we got the whole of Crime Stoppers in Kent taken down, followed by 560 people off the UK Most Wanted database, the national database in the UK, with one email. And you can hear all about that on those shows. However, because of this ongoing problem I've had, and I've actually caught Kent Professional Services and their legal services flat out lying, because I recorded a phone call, which I played on one of our shows, where I spoke to the legal services and I told them that they were committing crimes, that they were basically conspiring to pervert the course of justice by not supplying the evidence, as is their statutory duty, for 2 years. And then I get an email back from the assistant to the chief constable saying that, as you were told on the 10th of November, you're out of time for an appeal. Now, nobody said that. So that was a flat out lie on her behalf. And they think that's all right. So I go to the people who oversee the chief constable, and they said, well, the complaint about her will be looked into by, guess what, professional standards. I said, that's not acceptable. They are not capable or competent to investigate themselves because they're complicit in this criminality. Then I got back a letter from this other person in the office, the overseers of the chief constable, who said, I deem your request that we look into it to be an abusive process because we can't. Basically, right? So they are not there for any purpose. So you've got these layers of bureaucracy which protect the police from any liability whatsoever, like the Independent Office for Police Conduct, which replaced the IPCC, which by its own admission, as you can hear in the phone calls on Windows on the World, is not fit for purpose because they can't investigate the police. It has to go back to professional standards. So basically, professional standards of all the police forces in the country are the gatekeepers between you and the IPCC, or between you and any complaint you wish to lay, because the chief constable will never write back to you. And because he won't write back to you, he cannot be disciplined about anything. So the overseers of the chief constable don't even have a job. This is pathetic. And this is this huge bureaucracy. It's like a Soviet system. It's just jobs for people who need something to do, in my opinion. What do you think, Chris?
Well, yes. And it's going back to the people with their jet sprayers, isn't it? You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, we talked about that a while ago, yeah.
Yeah, but it's jobs for the boys.
Well, it's not even that. It's jobs for useful idiots, because what these people are is they are just gatekeepers. They don't do anything. They have no purpose. I've proved that these people who you report the police to have no purpose. None of them. The IPCC as it was, the IOPC as it is now. You've got these overseers of the inspectorate for the chief constable. They do not have a purpose. So there's people in offices writing letters that have no purpose. And I think this is really a very interesting point, because what we need to do, in my opinion, is to get smaller bureaucracy. And if you want smaller bureaucracy, then you're probably a fascist as well, or you're a Nazi, you know. This is the thing. But I think what we've done tonight is bring up some things that are very important we haven't brought up before, with these extremist ideologies being brought in. And then this kind of illusion of the far right, which is being pushed at us by MI5 through Demos, through think tanks, through Hope Not Hate, through especially the BBC. And it's an incredible kind of propaganda that once you look into this stuff, it doesn't seem to have any basis. I mean, Kevin, you get out and about quite a lot and you play a lot of music. Do you see this rise of the far right anywhere?
No. In fact, they seem to have kind of abated, really. I mean, all those kind of those National Front types. I mean, we don't see them. You know, they seem to have. They used to be around 20 years ago. But it's like the extremism from this. You're talking about establishment extremism, aren't you? That's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Word extremism. Well, that's always been around. It's just that it has to disguise itself as something other than it's always humanitarian, communitarian. It's a tyranny, but people don't realise it's a tyranny until it touches their own lives. But it is, and the thing that the kind of general malaise makes people start looking at it. I think just the fact that people's kids can't get houses and wages haven't gone up in 10 years or whatever it is. I mean, these are the kind of things that make people say, well, hang on, what's going on here? And once they do, people notice the tyranny. They notice the way that the BBC reports everything, and they see it's completely one-sided. The big issue that you have covered in the past, which relates to this, Mark, and which is, I think, people like us need to, kind of push in people's faces, is stop attacking the government of these people. They start more attacking the man in the street who to whom all this stuff is happening through his consent. Consent is the thing that empowers these people. They need our consent, and they actually do get it. I mean, I know they lie and everything, but the issue of the empowerment of these kind of fiends by our consent is something that people need to be made very aware of, and that they are consenting to their own, the children's own kind of bleak futures and all the rest of it. And eventually, I think people will act, will wake up. I mean, I do think that will happen. It might happen in very, 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 very dreadful circumstances if all this stuff going on in Syria is pushed into Israel wants America to attack Iran. That's what it wants. If it gets that, then we'll certainly have change on a scale we've never seen before.
Well, they've been trying that one for quite a number of years, rather unsuccessfully.
Well, they're still at it. They're at it right now. That's what that's what the demonization of Putin is a lot to do.
Absolutely, yeah.
They're bashing away at the Trump administration, to attack Iran. You never know. You never know how that might be manipulated, but that would be a dreadful thing to happen. And it's that's all connected. It's all connected to this global cultural Marxism. This kind of.
Oh yes, that our conspiracy theory, which these groups say doesn't exist, and of course, then it's some kind of anti-Semitic thing, or it's fascist, or whatever it is this week. It's usually one of those two.
I think
the Nazi thing.
Jews have to be called to account. I mean, they throughout history they've surrounded the establishment. I don't know if they are the establishment or if they're just kind of a vest that the establishment wear to get the shit kicked out of it when things go wrong for them. I can't actually work. You can't be sure about that. They do seem to be right going back to Cyrus of Persia. This kind of partnership between the criminal Gentile thugs who tend to run society, the establishment.
Oh, absolutely,
and the Jewish money guys who advise them and keep them, greased, keep their palms greased and their armies financed. This has gone on for centuries and centuries, and the fact that the vast majority of Jews don't question this role, I think is something that you just got to keep on at them about it. Come on, I mean. Some brave souls do, but I mean, I think we've got to normalise anti-Semitism. That's what we need to do. Because I don't think I'm anti-Semitic at all. I think, like Jesus Christ, he condemned Jewish leadership, and that's what we need to do. We need to save these people from the arseholes that lead them. I mean, the dreadful people that lead them, and it's still all that is still connected to what you're talking about tonight, Mark.
Absolutely, there's a very insidious nature underneath it all, and it's being directed, and yeah. This is the big thing, and of course you cannot be seen to criticise, and that's really what it's about. It's about controlling the narrative again. So, in other words, it's just psychological warfare, and of course, psychological warfare and psychology is what this is all about. It's all about psychology, and we've been reporting on that for weeks. It's psychological control. It's mind control. And people don't realise that mind control is a very simple thing, but its core, it's just basic psychology. You're making the person work against themselves. It's very, very simple. So this is the idea of the heresy idea we were talking about a while ago. And it's a very important one, I think, because the idea of that is that you are a free thinker, that you are not liable to a third party. If you're not liable to a third party, you're nobody's property. So if you're nobody's property, you're getting attacked left, right, and centre. And I don't mean that politically.
You would think they would come up with a better idea, Mark. These people who have to be in control. You would. I mean, it seems to be like Luciferianism. But you would think they would wake up to the fact that they, in the end, they always get this shit kicked out of them. You know, it always turns to crap in the end. And you know, people who these tyrannies fall and they suffer in more or less the same way they've made other people suffer. You would think, you know, they keep believing in this thing of this project they've got. Of total control or whatever it is, and you would think they would just wake up to them, because it's kind of stupid as well, you know, the stupidity of it. I mean, we sit here talking about things that about, you know, people calling, you know, basically harmless old Christians or whatever they are, Nazis. You realise how daft most of this stuff is, and it's. And when people realise it's daft and realise what it's done to them, then there's a reaction to that doesn't. I don't know. I can't understand the depth of the brainwashing that people like Hope Not Hate must live with themselves to be able to do that stuff. I mean, those guys in those offices who go around telling people, you know, about shouting anti-Semitism to the people who want to just have a meeting and talk about some serious issue. I mean, what kind of, are they brainwashed? Or are they just wicked? It's very hard to know, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what you think about that, but it's baffling. To some extent, it's baffling because, you know, these people also tend to think that we, the masses, are very stupid and, you know, sheep or something. You know, like we aren't divine beings as well, or whatever. You know what I mean? It's kind of anyway.
It's what it is. It's basically. It's mollycoddling. These people are mentally enfeebled. They can't think their way past anything. And that was very apparent if you watch the way Hope Not Hate have been kicked out of different areas. There's people who are just telling them to get that guy, Nick, to get in his car and go.
Yeah,
they're just telling him to leave, yeah. And they're not being particularly unreasonable. I mean, it could be construed as threatening. But when you look at him, you realise that he is clueless. He has got no argument against them at all. He's got nothing to say to them whatsoever.
Well, what's disturbing, Mark, and this is something that we should really stand firm on and make lots of noise about.
Yes.
And make a big issue of. What's really disturbing is that these people will not discuss facts. They will not discuss issues. They will not debate issues. And that tells you, it must tell you, well, I would think it must tell you, unless there's an element to this brainwashing which I don't understand, and there may be. It tells you that they're fundamentally either dishonest or there's some other pathological problem they've got, which kind of is a mystery to all of us. I can't understand, Mark. I can't understand an individual who, if I disagree with them, doesn't want to talk about what the facts of the matter are. I just don't get it. I mean, that's to me, and Nick Colliston doesn't get that either. He said to me, you know, what was his? He says. He said, if there's no such thing as truth, what's the point of getting up in the morning? That's Nick, you know. And we must demand, as you know, bring these kind of principles out. I mean, bring them to the BBC and let's have a debate. I mean, because if the public start getting the idea that they can demand a debate, they'll have to have one. You know, that the masses start taking that line, then these people are in real trouble because they'll lose the debates. The reason they never argue with us is because they'd lose the argument every time.
That was interesting, Kevin, because that brings us back to that first debate with Demos at Goldsmiths. When you engaged with them, there was a chap there called Jamie Bartlett, who's now their poster boy, who's on everything. He's even brainwashing people after work, giving them his time to instruct them on how society works and how we have to think. But these people are clueless, and they did lose the argument, and he couldn't even give me a response as to what I was talking about
how we should think is not to think. That's all it is. That was his position in that debate. No, we're not going to talk about that. There we go. So I mean, anyone who was there can see, if they're honest, they see what's going on. I mean, he wasn't prepared to debate the issue. because either he didn't know about it or he would definitely lose anyway. I mean, you know yourself.
Absolutely. And it just takes us back to that quote, which I've put out about 3 times tonight. The new democracy will work with a combination of government, open infiltration, and citizen groups taking direct action. I've given a few examples of those tonight, but isn't that an astounding statement for a think tank to make? A so-called think tank. Well, they should be called don't think tanks, really.
Very good, Mike. That's exactly it. Yeah, the don't think tank.
Don't think at all tanks. Well, that's what the Monster Raving Loony Party actually used to have, a drink tank, which was their idea of a think tank, which was basically, let's go down the pub and have a conversation and a couple of pints. That is a real think tank, though, isn't it? Rather than the don't think tank, because
Mark, maybe we should start a don't think tank and join the opposition and make lots of noise. They might fund us. What about that?
Yes, I think that brings us back to Chris, because he's been working on some satirical jingles recently, which are very good. What do you think of that, Chris? Does that fit in with your that fit in with your rather warped ideology, Chris? What do you say?
It's brilliant. Yeah, it's the non-think tank. I'll tell you something else. Has anybody noticed the amount of committees that are in their local councils now? I mean, my local council's got a safety committee. Safety of what?
Haven't you found out yet, Chris?
No, I'm a bit worried. I'm afraid I'd leave my house. I mean, in case I'm not safe. And also, councillors that suddenly they disappear and then they get into plum jobs in the council. Isn't that strange?
Well, yes,
I've noticed that.
I think they're allowed to. No, Chris, but they are allowed to reapply for different positions within the council. I don't think there's anything stopping them there, is there?
Yeah. I like the non-think tank, though. Yep, I think I could bring that up on. That's brilliant.
Well, I'll tell you just one other thing that is has come to my attention the last couple of days. And I was a school teacher for many years, and you see the adverts for school teachers on the radio and television now. They're almost desperate. I mean, they really can't get people. And all this kind of thing we're talking about, I mean, the safety thing about is someone safe? I mean, that's just one element of the stuff that was plaguing teachers, apart from loads of other stuff we would bore you with, and there isn't time. But I mean, the health and safety stuff. I mean, I remember once in with a year 8, I think, science class in the summer term, when everyone's kind of putting their feet up, getting to make a boat out of a plastic bottle and elastic bands and lolly sticks and stuff, and we're going to take it down the pond to float when they'd made their boats, and the person who saw us going there said, "Oh, you can't do that unless you fill in health and safety form. You go back to," and it was like, no, we're going to go down to. He said, "Somebody might fall in the water. Then what'll happen?" Well, I said, if one of them falls in the water, they'll learn more than they will from building than they did from building the boat, But it's like, this is the kind of thing you're dealing with all the time, and that's a comical and light side of it. But they can't get teachers now, so this is something that people become aware of, and it's something that the little stories that go with this, and when you meet people say it's an effing nightmare, and they tell you why. I mean, this is the stuff that just pops up in pub conversations, and people start to get the idea, Mark, of the kind of thing where just this total obsessive control that we're all dealing with, by people who are really clueless, I think, about how they're damaging their own project. Well,
I don't have to engage with it as much as people who are employed in organisations, because I have a certain amount of freedom. I've always wanted a certain amount of freedom from it. But even when I come up against it, I'm absolutely appalled by it all. Yeah, it's like, don't fall in the water. You might learn to swim, health and safety. Yeah. I mean, how did you learn to swim in the first place? You got these armbands on, then you took them off and go, oh God, I feel like I'm all right. Actually, I'm all right now. But with that panic, you see, that trauma should not have been allowed to happen. The community should have stood up when you were getting traumatized by that teacher who said, take your armbands off. They should have not been allowed to say that, because that traumatized you at that moment in time. And those people now have to be outed in our community. So those teachers who told you to take your armbands off, they are full of hate.
Yeah.
Another one I thought of this year, you might quite like, Chris. I was looking at Hope Not Hate's comedy website, and I just had this idea of the fried breakfast, the full English hate on a plate. What about that, eh?
Oh, I like that one.
Egg, bacon, sausage and mushrooms, hate on a plate.
A very quick thing, though, on a serious note, if I could just squeeze this in.
Yes.
People don't realise, I mean, backing up what Kevin was saying, that do you know that Mao Zedong got into China with less than 1% support of the entire population, and that led to something like a trillion deaths, and the Bolsheviks had less than 7%. So these people that are pumping out all this rubbish, the support in reality, what they have is, the percentage-wise, is probably exceptionally low.
That's the main point Chris was trying to get across, in that you've got this kind of over-empowered minority who's speaking on everyone's behalf. And if you don't allow them to speak on your behalf, then they will attack you, but they attack you in groups. That's what I'm trying to say, is that there's a very sinister undercurrent to this that's going on, which is basically psychological warfare and actually gang stalking. And we heard that on the alternative media, gang stalking. And a lot of the people who talk about it, in my opinion, aren't really being gang stalked, but that's a different issue. I mean, it's a totally different thing. But yes, getting back to this, yes, we are being controlled psychologically. That's all it is. It's basically the major agent of change is modern psychology. It is an art, science, therapy, religion, moral code, lifestyle, philosophy, and cult. It sits at the very center of contemporary society as an international colossus whose professional minions number in the hundreds of thousands. That was written in the early 80s, and that's more true today than it was then. But thanks a lot for being with us, Kevin.
But I just want to say one thing about that, Mark. The minions now, the problem they've got is the minions now are not as obedient as the minions were for the Bolsheviks and the Chinese. And a lot of these people in the army are as sick of this society as we are. They've been over there fighting alongside Al-Qaeda, and they've had it with everything. So they're not going to, the establishment have got more problems in imposing their tyrannies, really, than those the Chinese and the Russians ever had in those days. Because people
Very good place to leave it, Kevin. We're out of time, but that's a very good point. The people who are really at the front end, actually getting involved in this stuff, will not stand for it ultimately. That's it from Windows on the World. Back to you, Tony, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Have a great week.
All they got me,